Thank you, worship team. Good morning. It's great to see everybody this morning. Welcome to our service. If you're online, we especially want to welcome you to our service. Thank you for joining us that way. And for those of you in the building on campus, thank you for being here as well. It's a great day to be worshiping. A little bit hot, a little bit humid, but it is summer, right? Just a few announcements. First of all, our kids camp, our Juneteenth celebration, our kids camp went really great. Last week we were running. If you got here early, you saw some of the pictures of that stuff on the screen. We'll run those at the end of the service too, so you can check those out. But it was a wonderful time. Part of our kids camp was they're raising funds for our Afghan refugee relief work that we're doing. So they've raised around $500 for that already, and they've got some things on display out there. So you might want to check that out on your way out. And then I want to mention meal pack to you. No signal, do I? Oops. I probably just completely messed it up, Joe. I think I just powered it off. Anyway, don't let the pastor touch buttons when he's supposed to be talking. Anyway, meal pack. I just want to update you on where we are with our meal pack. So our goal is $28,000. That's the budget for the entire meal pack that we plan to do in November. We are at about $18,000. We need to be at 20 by August in order to move forward. Otherwise, we feel like we need to give them a heads up that we need to pull out, because that's our last opportunity to do that and not affect Feed My Starving Children. So we want to give them as best heads up as we can if we need to do that, so that they can fill that slot that we would have taken. And so August is that time frame. So we're about $2,000 away from our first goal, which is $20,000, and our total goal is $28,000. So I just want to update you on that. Our team is still working on all of this, and they'll be coming to you in the next few weeks as well, just to let you know what other opportunities you might have to be a part of this. But I wanted to update you on that. And again, Juneteenth, check out those pictures from Juneteenth in our kids camp. And I just want to say thanks to all of our volunteers who helped make both of those really great successes. I do want us to have a prayer this morning. We are in a transient area, so people come and people go. Some of you know Mark and Lynn Robinson. Mark is in the military, and they got really short notice, and they are on the move to Texas, I think, this week. It came really quick. They weren't really expecting a move for another year or two, I don't think. So I just want to let you know they're going to be moving. Ask you to pray for them, because a move is never easy, but when it comes really short notice, that's even more difficult. So just pray for them and their stress levels, and as they manage all of those details over the next couple of weeks. So let's go to God in prayer. God, we thank you for this opportunity to worship you and to focus on you. We thank you for just the events that we had this past week of just being able to celebrate together and be together and connect with each other. We thank you for Camp Compassion and just what our kids learned about following you and caring about others as your followers. And so we thank you and praise you for that. I thank you for each of the leaders for that camp and just how they invested in our kids over this last week. We do pray for Mark and Lynn and for their kids as they get ready to move. They're in the middle of all of that right now, and just pray that everything would go smoothly and just all the details would come together, and you would just give them all of the strength and energy that they need to do that. And then, God, I pray you to open our hearts and our minds today as we wrap up this series and look deeper into the book of Ruth and just your work through all of that to lead us to a point that you want us to be at. So open our hearts and minds to what you want us to know. In Christ's name I pray, amen. So we are wrapping up our series on Ruth. We've been talking about the unseen work of God. If you missed any of this, it's all online. You might want to check those out. They kind of build on each other a little bit. But we're using that title, The Unseen Work of God, because as you read through the book of Ruth, God is barely mentioned in the entire book. But even though he's barely mentioned, there is evidence of God's work all throughout the story of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. So as we wrap this up this morning, I want to just start by just kind of recapping the story a little bit, because it begins with a family who was from Israel, and it was Naomi and her husband Elimelech, and they moved to a country called Moab because there was a famine in the land of Israel. So they go to Moab, and not too long after arriving at Moab, Naomi's husband dies. And they have 2 sons that moved with them, and they get married. They married local girls, Moabite women, and about 10 years later, both of Naomi's sons die as well. So just devastating tragedy hits Naomi. And so Naomi is now a widow. Her daughters-in-law are living with her. They're now widows. There's this devastating economic crisis still going on in Israel. There's all this racial tension between Israel and Moab. And if you read the book of Ruth, all of this happens during the period of history called the Judges for Israel. And the period of Judges was one of the most chaotic times in the nation of Israel. Just some really, really tough stuff going on. So Naomi is just in a terrible position, the worst possible position she could be in. Now, in that culture, in the culture that Naomi was living in, there was essentially 4 ways that a widow could survive. One of the ways a widow could survive was to work, which was very, very difficult because it would have been working in the fields. It was manual labor, physical labor, very demanding. And Naomi, at this point, is really just too old. And as we read her story, she's really just too beaten down to take any of that stuff on, that kind of physical work. Secondly, a widow could get remarried, but Naomi is too old to get remarried, which we don't understand at all, do we, in our culture? Because in our culture, you're never too old to get married or remarried. But in the ancient culture that Naomi lived in, you essentially didn't marry for companionship like we do. You got married in order to reproduce children who could provide cheap labor and carry on the family name. I mean, back then, and we certainly don't have a reference point for this at all, but back then, children actually made you money, right? I mean, we can't even grasp that, can we? Not today. My kids are both adults. They're still costing me quite a bit, but it's okay. I love them. But again, this wasn't even an option for Naomi. And third, a widow could be supported by her children, but Naomi's sons have both died, so that's not an option for her. And then fourth, the widow could rent the family land so someone else could work it and have some money there, but that's not an option for Naomi because the family land had been sold when her Elimelech moved to Moab and left the country. So Naomi is really in a hopeless situation. But as we've seen, God is at work in this story. And God is working behind the scenes in ways that Naomi could have never imagined that God was at work. And one of the ways that he's at work is through her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who shows Naomi this, what we talked about last week, this hesed love, this incredibly generous love with no strings attached to it kind of a thing. And one of the ways that Ruth does that is when Naomi decides to return home, to go back to Israel, Ruth insists on going with her, even though it wasn't the best thing for Ruth. It was actually a risky move for Ruth to do, going to a foreign land where there's all of this racial tension, and at a time in Israel when there's all kinds of chaos going on, it was not the safest thing for Ruth to do. But she loves Naomi, and so she goes with her to Israel. And when they arrived back in Israel, as we saw last week, it was right in the middle of the barley harvest. And last week we saw Ruth go into the fields, right, to glean. And gleaning was basically going and picking up the leftovers. This was part of the Jewish laws, that the owners of these fields, they could make a profit on their lands, but they couldn't maximize their profit. They were required to leave the edges untouched, unharvested, and they were not allowed to go back over the field a second time and pick up anything that they missed or anything that fell off of the carts that they were loading stuff up on. This was just one of the ways that was built into the law of the nation of Israel, where they took care of the poor. The poor could come out and glean what was left over, and it would provide some help for them and for their families. And Ruth just happens to show up at a field that is owned by a guy named Boaz, which was actually one of Naomi's relatives through her husband Elimelech. And Boaz shows Ruth, we saw last week, the same kind of love, that hesed love that she had shown to Naomi before. He invites her to harvest along with his workers in a way that would be safer for her. He invites her to eat with them. He provides water for her. And most importantly, he tells his male workers that she is not to be harmed, that they are not to harass her or bother her or let anybody else do that either. Now, at this point in the story, Ruth doesn't know that Boaz is actually a relative of Naomi and that he has a legal and financial power to restore Naomi's finances. And when Naomi finds out that Ruth was working in Boaz's field, she immediately recognizes who he was, that she's related to him, and she puts together this plan to try to get Boaz to marry Ruth. And in chapter 3, and I'll let you read it for yourself, but you should read it. It's a neat story in that part of the story. But in chapter 3, we see this very romantic scene where Ruth goes through the threshing floor where Boaz was working. He was sleeping at night, and she lays at his feet. And when he wakes up in the middle of the night, Ruth says, "Cover me with your garment," which literally meant in that culture, marry me, which was unheard of for a woman to do that. A completely bold thing to do in that culture. And Boaz immediately says, yes, right? Incredible story. I told you, Ruth is a love story. But then you get to the end of chapter 3, and there's a twist. Boaz tells Ruth that there's actually an even closer relative than him, and who has the first legal right. He's first in line, has the legal right to marry her and to restore the family's finances. So at the end of chapter 3, we don't know what's going to happen here. We don't know if Ruth is going to marry this amazing guy, Boaz, who has shown her all of this love and grace and compassionate. You know, he's the one that we're all rooting for at the end of chapter 3. We don't know if she's going to marry him or if this jerk, right, is going to come along and just ruin the entire story. So what's going to happen? And that brings us to chapter 4, where we see Boaz at the city gate, which was essentially the courthouse. And he's waiting to find out what this other guy who's first in line is going to do. And everything pretty much hinges on this guy's decision. So here's what happens in chapter 4. Meanwhile, Boaz went to the town gate and sat there just as the kinsman redeemer, that's this other guy, the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned, came along. Boaz says, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down," right? He's going to suck up to him a little bit. So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." So he's just explaining to this guy, hey, this is where you are, and this is where I am in all of this. And the guy looks at Boaz, and he says, "I'll do it." Right? He says, "I will redeem it." And we read that part of the story, and we go, shoot, right? I mean, that's actually the church version of what some of you would probably say, right? But anyway, the guy says, "I'll do it." He says, "I'll marry her, and I will be Naomi's kinsman redeemer. I will marry Ruth." Now we've talked about this idea of kinsman redeemer already, but I just want to go in a little bit more detail about the role that it played in the life of the nation of Israel at this time. Basically, the kinsman redeemer is the Hebrew word goel. And the kinsman redeemer was one of several provisions that God gave in the law of Moses to help families that had fallen on hard times, that were struggling, particularly financially. And all of this is outlined in the book of Leviticus. And this particular part of the law was given to help families who have fallen on hard times and had to actually sell their land, their family properties. And in this agricultural society, which Israel was at the time, land was the primary way of making a living. So when you sold it, that income was lost, and it was lost for generations to come. Land was everything to them. And so if a piece of land got sold or it got taken away, it could affect a family for generations. And so it was a huge deal, because then you have generations of families that were just kind of stuck in this never-ending cycle of poverty. So the law said that if the land had been lost, it could actually be redeemed. It could be purchased back by a member of the extended family. It was a way of keeping families together, and it was a way of kind of breaking this endless cycle of what would be generational poverty. It gave the family a second chance, a way to change their financial futures. It was truly an act of redemption. Now, in this case, choosing to be the kinsman redeemer comes at a pretty high price, and not just the price of buying the land. In this case, the kinsman redeemer has to purchase back Naomi's land at his own expense. And because Naomi is too old to have more children, he would have to marry Ruth in order to have heirs to work the land and make it productive. But marrying Ruth comes with risk because he would be marrying a Moabite woman. And like I said, there's all this racial tension between these two countries. And so that just puts him at a difficult spot if he chooses to do this. And then, and this is what gets overlooked in this story so many times, any children that he had with Ruth would not technically be his heirs. They would be the heirs of Ruth's husband who has already died. And in a culture where status and standing is all about who your heirs are, this was a huge sacrifice for the kinsman redeemer to take on. So the guy who is first in line to be kinsman redeemer, he says, yes, I want to do this. But then this happens. Then Boaz says, he's talking to this other guy, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's widow. So he's reminding him of what all this looks like in order to maintain the name of the dead, which is Ruth's husband, with his property. And now this guy, he realizes exactly what he's potentially getting into. And this is what happens. And at this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today, you are my witnesses. So let me unpack that just a little bit. At first, the guy who is first in line to be the kinsman redeemer, he thinks this is a really, really good deal. He thinks that since Naomi's husband is gone, that if he purchases land, basically all he has to do, because she's past childbearing years, all he has to do is essentially take care of her until she dies. Just take care of her for the rest of her life. And since both of her sons have passed away, the land would revert back to him and to his heirs, and it would just be an easy way to accumulate more wealth. But Boaz reminds him that this is not how it works. That this is not just about getting a quick piece of property, that there is a relational obligation, and there's a good bit of risk to this with all of this financial stuff. That it's not just a little bit of financial gain for him. In fact, since Ruth was still young, it's possible that she could have lots of children, and all of those heirs would not only inherit this part of the estate, but those heirs could lay claim to the rest of this guy's estate as well. And when he realizes the cost, when he realizes the risk and the sacrifice, that is just too much. And so he bails. And now we come kind of to the pinnacle of this incredible love story. It says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms, talking about little baby Obed that we talked about last week, took her child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, a couple of things here. When the text says that Ruth was better to Naomi than 7 sons, that wasn't just a declaration on how great Ruth was. I mean, Ruth was great, but that's not what it's talking about here. The term 7 sons was a way of talking about the perfect family. 7 was a heavenly number. It was a perfect number in the Hebrew culture. It was about perfection and all of that. So 7 sons was a phrase used for talking about the perfect family. And in a culture where family determined your standing in a society, the perfect family was everything. It's what gave you your sense of identity. That standing and that status that came from your family, it gave you that sense of identity within the culture. So when the women say to Naomi that Ruth is better to you than 7 sons, they're actually telling Naomi that her identity is not rooted in having the perfect family. They're telling her that her identity is rooted in God's grace that was manifested in Ruth's hesed love towards her. I think one of the biggest issues that we face today is the temptation to try to create our own sense of identity, to kind of create our own sense of who we are. And in our performance-driven culture, it may not be the perfect family anymore that we try to create a sense of identity around, but it's definitely other things, isn't it? Maybe it's the perfect career path, or maybe it's the perfect body, or the perfect relationship, or the perfect house, or whatever it is that we look to get a sense of who we are, and we get a sense of our identity from it. But all of those things, they are fragile identities. And they are fragile identities because any one of those things can fail, or can be lost, or can be taken away from us. And when they're lost, then our identities are lost. But when our identity is found in and it's rooted in God's grace, God's hesed love for us, then no matter what happens, we will not ever lose our sense of identity. No matter what is going on in our lives, no matter what happens in our lives, we will not lose the sense of who we are at our core. Now, I've said several times in this series that the book of Ruth was written to point the people of Israel to something. The kinsman redeemer in the story was pointing Israel and pointing us to another kinsman redeemer who was willing to pay the price, a kinsman redeemer who was willing to sacrifice whatever it took, who was not willing to walk away when the price was his life, so that he might redeem us and that our futures might be changed and secured. The book of Ruth is not a history lesson for us. The book of Ruth is pointing to Jesus. It's pointing to the Messiah. And even though at that point in history they had no idea of the specifics of Jesus or any of that and what would come, they had no idea, and yet somehow God weaves this book together, and it is pointing us to the kinsman redeemer, Jesus. Look at how the book of Ruth ends. I said it didn't begin like a typical love story begins. It doesn't end like a typical love story ends either. It ends with this very, very mundane and ordinary listing of the genealogy of a guy named Perez, who we haven't even heard of up until now. This is how it ends. This is the last passage in the book of Ruth. It says, "This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Aminadab, Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David." And from David, we know, comes the line and the lineage of Jesus, the Messiah. I mean, think about that. God takes all of these events that at times very difficult events in Naomi's life, very difficult events in Ruth's life, difficult events in Boaz's life, and he weaves them together with the very ordinary events of the lives of those that have gone before, and the very ordinary events of the lives that those who follow after them, to provide the ultimate kinsman redeemer who will change the world, who will redeem the world. So here's how I would wrap this whole thing up. The story of Ruth invites us to ask a really, really important question. And I think the question is this: have we embraced the sacredness of the ordinary in our lives? Have you embraced the sacredness of the ordinary in your lives? Have you embraced the idea that doing something great for the kingdom of God is not about doing something extraordinary? It's about inviting God into the ordinary things of your life. your everyday relationship, your everyday little task that you do, the decisions that seem so small and so insignificant to you, the way you respond to challenging situations, all of those things that we do on a daily basis that are just part of the ordinariness of life that end up being used by God, woven together in such a way that it changes the world. It changes your world, and it changes somebody's world around you. See, I think most of us are waiting for that big thing. We're waiting for that big thing that we're going to do, that we're going to be a part of, and we will just know. We will know that God is using us because of how big that thing is. And we're like, God, when am I going to be a part of your world-changing efforts? I'm looking for that. I'm praying for that. God, when is that big thing going to happen? And God is saying, it's happening right here. It's happening right now. It's all around you. It's every day. The decisions you make, the things that you do, the way you respond, the way in which you react, the way you follow, the way you obey. God is saying, I take that ordinary things in your life and I weave them together in such a way that it changes the world. Sometimes we downplay what we're doing because it just doesn't seem that significant to us. And imagine if Ruth and Naomi and Boaz had all felt that way too. They had no idea what God was doing. And just like Ruth, God is always at work behind the scenes, weaving our stories into his grand plan for redemption in this world. So embrace the sacredness of the ordinary of your life. Don't miss that, because it's those ordinary looking things that God will use to change the world. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you for this story. And again, we thank you for whoever wrote it down. And we thank you for the fact that it's been saved and protected and translated all throughout the years that we can have it today to learn more about who you are and the work that you're doing in this world. So I thank you for Ruth. I thank you for Naomi. I thank you for Boaz. I thank you for just how you just took some really weird sometimes and ordinary and just mundane kind of decisions that they made and things they did to weave all of that together, to bring them together to that moment in time that would ultimately lead to other moments in time that would ultimately lead to Jesus coming and changing the world. So I thank you that you are that kind of God, that is the way that you work in this world, through ordinary people, through ordinary things. And that's the way you continue to work today, through each and every one of us, as ordinary people doing our normal, ordinary lives. And so we pray, Lord, that we would allow you to use us. And God, I pray that every now and then we would stop and we would look back at our lives and we would look at how you are working, maybe behind the scenes, and we didn't even realize what you were doing. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Hey, thanks for being here today. I hope you have a great week. And like I said last week, if you're traveling this summer, I hope you have great travels. Please be safe. Do hang around, chat with each other, introduce yourself. If there's people here that you don't know or if you haven't seen in a couple of weeks, say hello. Check out the stuff the kids have. They want you to see what they did all week in camp and be a part of that. And have a great week. Let's stand one more time and sing our closing song.